In this Taiwan Insider video, I'm going to talk about racism, ethnic chauvinism, and skin color discrimination as they exist in Taiwan and in Chinese society generally. Now, some of you may be asking what Chinese society has to do with Taiwan. When I say Chinese, what I'm talking about is nothing to do with citizenship, so it doesn't make any difference if Taiwan is independent or not. The insults and derogatory terms covered here apply just the same. They also apply to present-day Hong Kong, for example, just as much as they would have applied to Hong Kong under British colonial rule. So, what I'll be looking at here mostly is pan-Chinese racism used against non-Chinese, and most of what I'll cover here is essentially the same in any ethnically Chinese society. 大同小异. However, there are some regional differences, and of course pronunciation of the insults covered here varies from place to place, and I'll cover some of that too. But there are so many racist and derogatory terms in Chinese that covering them all, including all the regional variations, would take many hours, so this is just a brief introduction. My motivation for making this video is mostly owed to seeing a video made by a well-known Swedish YouTuber living in Taiwan, in which he interviewed a black girl who asserted that there wasn't much racism in Taiwan, and that she hadn't heard any insults directed at her, with the implication that such insults would have come to her in English. This is an incredibly naive notion. A few days after that, I read a news report in which, as I remember, an African American picked a fight with a passenger on a bus, whom he had heard saying nigger, the Mandarin word for that, taking it to be the English racist insult nigger. Obviously, before anyone jumps to the conclusion that people are or are not insulting them, they need to understand something of the language of the country they are in. Because generally speaking, people do not tailor their insults to other people's languages. I would say that, at an absolute minimum, you need to understand at least more than 60% of everything you hear on the streets to make any judgment. And it's probably even more the case with insults, that most people are even less confident of using them in a foreign language than they are of using regular conversational terms in a foreign language. If you are new to Taiwan and don't understand a lot of what you hear, then obviously it's difficult to get a grasp on race prejudice here, but this may serve as a stopgap measure. I will also address the issue of skin color discrimination in ethnic Chinese society, and particularly in Taiwan, as this is very closely related. If you feel depressed at the end of all this, bear in mind that things are much, much better than when I first came here in the mid-1980s, and I'll throw in a few examples to illustrate that. As a young, or at least younger guy, I travelled in several dozen countries and worked in 8 or 9 of them, so I spent extended periods of time in those countries. I never came across a country, or a self-governing region, whatever, whose people were free of race and ethnic prejudice, and I don't believe such a place exists. Basically, where there are humans being discriminated against on the basis of race, ethnicity, or skin colour. This is just human nature, even if it's not a very noble aspect of it. This video is part of the Taiwan Insider series, so it's primarily about discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, or skin color as it exists in Taiwan, although I do look at other closely related ethnically Chinese societies. It isn't about discrimination in Britain or Brazil or any other place not predominantly ethnically Chinese. Yes, I know race prejudice exists in all those places. If you're interested in finding out more about race prejudice in some other country, there are certain to be videos on the internet dealing with that subject. I'll first give you a taster of how things were in Taiwan in the late 1980s and early 1990s. At that time I worked part-time as an English language home tutor, and I advertised my services in various places. Several potential students inquiring about my rates and availability wanted to be sure I wasn't black before hiring. One woman even expressed great relief when I assured her that I wasn't, and then she told me, "Sorry to ask, but I have to be sure. I can't have my children being taught by a black man." Around the same time, early 1992, there was an explosion of anti-foreign sentiment in Taiwan and a massive purge of undocumented foreign workers, which was just about all foreign workers at that time. A pedestrian subway right in the heart of Taipei by the railway station was daubed from end to end with the words "Kill foreigners" and "Kill black devils" painted in red paint in Chinese and in English. It remained that way for at least a week, which can be taken as a measure of the level of acceptance of xenophobia at that time. The so-called black devils in question were not blacks, but Southeast Asians. This insult applies to anyone darker than Chinese, as we'll see in a little while. Shortly after I moved to Hong Kong, I ran into 3 Sri Lankans I had met briefly in Taiwan some months before the purge. All were visibly bruised, and one claimed his eyesight had been permanently affected by the beatings he had received at the hands of immigration officers at the detention centre the 3 of them had been sent to before expulsion from Taiwan. I had no reason to disbelieve them, and every reason to believe them. My girlfriend had recently begun work at the Singapore Airlines check-in desk at Taoyuan Airport, and she told me that many of the illegal aliens forcibly expelled from Taiwan also seemed to have been badly beaten not long before arriving at the airport. So, things are much better in Taiwan right now, and foreign nationals of every creed and colour are apparently much more welcome. But bear in mind that these things can easily change very quickly. Taiwan's history of ethnic tolerance is a very short one. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the popular racist insults. So, let's look first at the term "hei gui." This is a very common insult used towards darker-skinned people, and this is what the man on the bus mentioned earlier would have said if he really did want to insult that African American. If you follow the news, you may have seen a BBC report in early 2022 which covered a Chinese national in Malawi making demeaning videos of black Africans, including one in which a group of kids sang, "I'm a black devil and I have a low IQ." This particular video resulted in the Chinese communists condemning it, and the guy who made it eventually being deported.
On a Chinese social media
but in fact, making demeaning videos about blacks in Africa is big business for Chinese entrepreneurs. The man who made the above-mentioned video claimed he was only promoting Chinese culture, and in a sense he was, at least promoting one unhealthy aspect of it.
Which could be translated as
soon after that BBC documentary, on orders from Beijing, social media platforms such as WeChat and TikTok blocked users from searching video accounts containing the term Africa. But prior to that, to illustrate how popular such videos are, one Chinese national who went by the name African Mr. Hello had 10 million followers across various Chinese social media platforms. When interviewed by an overseas media outlet, he even gave the opinion that, and I quote, "This is not China, but Africa. Africans are inherently savage, barbaric, you know? They only have profit in their eyes." Actually, the Chinese government crackdown on insulting videos of Africans was more than a little disingenuous, because the Chinese government is not above making racist videos itself when it suits its purpose, as when Indian border troops prevented China from building a road through Bhutanese territory, thereby violating a previous agreement made in 1998 not to alter the territorial status quo. You can get a more genuine feel for the general Chinese sentiment towards blacks from items of popular Chinese culture, such as this TV commercial. Wow! Anyway, although the above-mentioned BBC documentary brought Chinese racism against blacks to international attention, it has to be pointed out that the term Heigui does not refer only to African blacks, but to all people with a skin colour darker than the average Chinese. That includes even Southeast Asians, and over the years I've heard Thais, to name just one group, being called Heigui by Taiwan Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, Singapore and Malaysian Chinese, and PRC citizens too. Some people in Taiwan may remember the popular toothpaste brand Dali was once called Darky. The one-letter name change, which I heard was undertaken with great reluctance and objections, came about because of American diplomatic pressure. It came to the attention of the American Institute in Taiwan only because it had an English name. In the case of Heiguiyo, or Black Devil Oil, which can be found in Chinese medicine shops all across Singapore, there is no English name, so the brand has always been able to sell happily under a racist name with no objections from interfering foreigners. It features, or at least used to feature, an image of the Singaporean Chinese concept of a black devil. Although in theory the Malay population of Singapore, who are almost universally regarded as lazy by the Chinese majority, are also black devils, as far as I can tell, the term black devil in Singapore is generally reserved for the city-state's ethnic Indian population, who are almost universally regarded as dirty and unhygienic by the Chinese majority. On a side note, it should perhaps be mentioned that the term Chinese Singaporean is an English construct intended to facilitate smooth relations with Singapore's non-Chinese population. In Chinese, the term is Singapore Chinese. This may seem like a minor difference, but in fact is very significant. It means that the city-state's Chinese population see themselves principally as Chinese, not essentially any different from Taiwan Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, Shanghai Chinese. These are all just locations from the Chinese viewpoint. Here's a typically racist quip made several decades ago by Chu Wei-kiang, a former Singapore MP, in a parliamentary speech. One evening, I drove to Little India, and it was pitch dark. Not because there was no light, but because there were too many Indians around. His racist witticism about Indian skin colour didn't result in any objections from other members of Parliament. In the 1990s, while Singapore was still led by Lee Kuan Yew, himself a racist and a bigot of worldwide repute, openly racist comments were still acceptable at every level of Singapore society. Today they wouldn't be, but only if they were public comments made in English in a place like Parliament. On the street, speaking Chinese, people make such racist comments about the city-state's Heigui population every day. Okay, now let's get to the use of the term Heigui in Taiwan. As you can see from this news report, the insult is still very much alive and well, and was used here to taunt a basketball player in a University Basketball Association match. So it's still an insult that easily slips from the lips of young Taiwanese. However, the good news is that this resulted in the association banning the offending players from further tournaments, and eventually an apology was forthcoming. That's something which certainly wouldn't have happened 30 years ago. So there has been some progress in this respect. Well, this video has only covered one racist term, so obviously another couple at least will be needed to fully introduce the fundamentals of discrimination based on race, ethnic group and skin colour in Taiwan, and in ethnically Chinese society in general. See you again soon.